May 7th, 1945, Camp Carson, Colorado. The Rocky Mountains rose like broken teeth
Please, I
against
have
the
to get
sky
out of
so
here.
blue
Calm
it hurt
down.
to look at.
You're in shock.
No, you
Liesl
don't
Hartman
understand.
had never seen mountains like these. Dresden
No,
had
please
hills,
don't
gentle
leave
slopes
me.
that rolled into forests where
I
she played
can't
as a
bet.
child. These mountains were different. They were violent, sharp, indifferent. They didn't care about the war. They didn't care that Germany had surrendered 2 days ago. They didn't care that she was 23 years old and more afraid than she'd ever been in her life. The transport truck rattled through the gates. Barbed wire, guard towers, searchlights, the machinery of containment. 43 women sat in silence, pressed together on wooden benches, their Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms stained with sweat and salt from 3 weeks crossing the Atlantic. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? They'd lost. They'd been captured. They were prisoners now in a country they'd been taught to fear more than death itself. Liesl gripped the edge of the bench. Her hands were shaking. They'd been shaking since Hamburg, since the moment the American soldiers had surrounded their communications unit and ordered them to surrender. 3 months ago, another lifetime. The girl who'd answered telephones in Carlsbad, who'd routed military calls with efficient precision, who'd believed in the cause because believing was easier than questioning, that girl was gone. What remained was this hollow thing, this trembling shell, trying to remember how to breathe. The truck stopped. Soldiers appeared. American soldiers. Young men with tired eyes and rifles slung over their shoulders. They gestured for the women to climb down. Nobody moved. Then Greta, the oldest among them at 42, stood first. The others followed. Liesl's legs almost gave out when her boots hit the ground. The altitude here was different. The air was thin, or maybe that was just fear stealing her breath. They were herded toward a large building. Processing, someone said. Standard procedure. Liesl looked around. The camp was enormous. Rows of barracks stretched in every direction. Thousands of men in German uniforms stood in long queues waiting. For what? Food interrogation execution. She'd been told so many things, she didn't know what was true anymore. A sergeant appeared. Tall, broad-shouldered, maybe 26 or 27. His name tag read Whitmore. He had a clipboard. He didn't look cruel. That was the first surprise. The propaganda had promised cruelty. It had promised monsters. This man looked like someone's son. Tired, overworked, human. Women prisoners this way, he said in English. Then again in broken German. Frauen here. They followed him into a separate area, away from the men. That made sense. That was protocol. But Liesl's stomach twisted anyway. Separation could mean anything. It could mean protection. It could mean something worse. She'd heard stories. The Eastern Front, what the Red Army did to German women when they entered a town. The propaganda had been very specific about that, very detailed. And if the Russians did such things, why wouldn't the Americans? She tried to remember what she'd been taught. The training had started in 1943. Liesl had volunteered for the Wehrmacht auxiliary because it meant regular meals and a paycheck to send home to Dresden. Her father worked in a factory. Her mother took in sewing. Her older brother was already at the front. The family needed money. Patriotism was a luxury. Survival was arithmetic. They'd sent her to Carlsbad for training, switchboard operation, communications protocol, military discipline, and something else. Something that had started small but grown larger as the war turned bad. Ideological preparation, they called it. What to expect if Germany lost. What to expect if you were captured. The instructor had been a woman. That made it worse somehow. Frau Dietrich, 40 years old, severe, a true believer. She'd stood at the front of the classroom with photographs pinned to a board behind her, photographs of dead German soldiers, photographs of burned cities, photographs of women's faces bruised and blank. The Americans, Frau Dietrich had said, her voice calm, matter-of-fact, are not civilized like us. They are mongrels, mixed races, no discipline, no honor. Their soldiers are animals, especially the African ones. If you are captured, you must understand what will happen. She'd gone into detail, specific, terrible detail. Medical examinations used as excuses for humiliation. Photographs taken, bodies exposed, dignity stripped away systematically, deliberately, as punishment for being German, for being women, for being on the losing side. Death is preferable, Frau Dietrich had said. Remember that. If capture is inevitable, you have a choice. Die with honor or live with shame. Liesel had sat in that classroom and felt cold. The other women had too. But they'd all nodded, they'd all believed, or at least they'd believed enough. Because if you didn't believe, if you questioned, then what were you fighting for? What had your brother died for? What had Dresden burned for? The propaganda had been everywhere by 1945. Radio broadcasts, leaflets, whispered warnings from officers. The message was always the same. The enemy is inhuman. The enemy will destroy you. Better to die fighting than to surrender. And Liesel had believed. She'd believed because the alternative was accepting that everything, all of it, the war, the deaths, the suffering, had been for nothing. For a lie. But now she was here. In Colorado. In America. And the man with the clipboard looked tired, not monstrous. The camp had barracks, not torture chambers. There was food. She could smell it. Bread. Real bread. When was the last time she'd smelled real bread? The confusion was almost worse than fear. They were led into a large room. Tables, chairs, American soldiers behind desks with typewriters and forms. More processing. Names recorded. Units. Home cities. Liesel gave her information in halting English. She'd learned some from the translators she'd worked with, enough to understand basic questions. Dresden, the clerk repeated when she said her hometown. He looked up. Something in his eyes changed. Pity, disgust. The bombing, February, I'm sorry. She hadn't expected that. An apology from an American. For Dresden. Her throat tightened. She nodded. Couldn't speak. Next station, more questions. Had she been a member of the Nazi Party? Numb. Had she participated in combat operations? Numb. Had she witnessed war crimes? The question hung in the air. How did you answer that? What counted as a crime when everything was burning? No, she said. The clerk made a note, moved on. Across the room, male prisoners were being processed through similar stations. Liesel watched them. Wehrmacht soldiers, Luftwaffe pilots, old men, teenage boys. They looked defeated, exhausted. Some were crying. One man, maybe 60 years old, was shaking so badly he couldn't hold the pen to sign his form. A soldier American younger than Liesel put a hand on the old man's shoulder, steadied him, spoke quietly in German. It's all right, you're safe now, just sign here. Safe. The word didn't make sense. They were prisoners. Prisoners weren't safe. Prisoners were punished. That's what she'd been taught. But the American soldier wasn't punishing anyone. He was helping an old man sign a form. The cognitive dissonance was making her dizzy. Next came medical screening. The announcement was made in both English and German. All prisoners required health examination, tuberculosis check, typhus screening, lice inspection. Standard protocol. The men were directed to one set of tents, the women to another, and that's when the fear came roaring back. Medical examination. The words triggered every warning, every lecture, every horror story Frau Dietrich had planted in her mind. This was it. This was the moment. They'd separate the women, take them to the medical tents, and then the humiliation would begin. Just like she'd been told. Liesel's hand started shaking again. Worse this time. She looked at the other women. They were all pale. Greta was praying under her breath. Sophie, only 19, was crying silently. They all knew. They'd all been warned. The medical tents were visible from where they stood. Large canvas structures with open flaps. She could see inside. Examination tables, medical equipment, soldiers moving back and forth. And beyond the tents in the main processing yard, hundreds of male prisoners standing in queues waiting their turn. Hundreds of eyes, hundreds of potential witnesses. Frau Dietrich's voice echoed in her memory. They will photograph you. They will make you undress in front of soldiers. They will document your humiliation as proof of their victory. Liesel wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted to die just like Frau Dietrich had said. Death with honor. Better than this. But there was nowhere to run. The camp was surrounded by fences and mountains and armed guards. There was only forward. Only through. A nurse appeared. American, maybe 30 years old. Dark hair pulled back, clean uniform. She had a clipboard too. She called names in careful German, mispronouncing most of them. Keller, Fischer, Hartmann. Liesel's name, her group, 12 women total. They were led toward the nearest medical tent. The walk felt eternal. Every step was a countdown. Liesel focused on breathing. In, out, in, out. Don't think about what's coming. Don't think about the stories. Don't think about the photographs on Frau Dietrich's board. But she couldn't stop thinking. They entered the tent. The smell hit her first. Antiseptic. Clean. Not the smell of decay or death or cruelty. Just medicine. The tent was well lit. Afternoon sun filtered through the canvas, making everything glow amber. There were 3 examination areas separated by thin privacy screens. Not much privacy. You could see shadows through the canvas, shapes, movements, and the tent flaps were open, wide open, facing the main processing yard, where hundreds of men stood waiting, where anyone could look in. A doctor appeared, white coat, stethoscope around his neck. He looked about 32, brown hair starting to gray at the temples. He had kind eyes. That surprised her. She'd expected cruelty or coldness. Instead, he just looked tired, deeply, profoundly tired. His name tag read Thornton, Dr. M. Thornton. He spoke in English first, then repeated himself in German. His accent was American, but his German was decent. Standard medical examination. We need to check for tuberculosis, typhus, and other communicable diseases. It will take approximately 4 minutes per person. Please remove your outer uniform when called. Remove your outer uniform. The words hit like a physical blow. Liesel looked around. The examination areas had those thin canvas screens. The tent walls were translucent in the sunlight. Every movement inside cast shadows visible from outside. And those open flaps facing the yard where hundreds of men stood. Not in front of everyone. The thought was desperate, primal. Please, not in front of everyone. The first woman was called forward. Margaret, 41 years old, mother of 3. She stepped behind the privacy screen with the nurse. The shadow play began. Silhouettes removing clothing, the doctor's shape approaching. The examination. Liesel couldn't watch but couldn't look away. 4 minutes. That's what the doctor had said. 4 minutes that felt like 4 hours. Margaret emerged, face blank, eyes distant. She wouldn't meet anyone's gaze. Second woman, same procedure, same shadow dance, same hollow expression afterward. Third woman. Then it was Liesel's turn. Dr. Thornton gestured toward the privacy screen. His expression was professional, neutral, not cruel but not particularly kind either. Just doing his job, processing another prisoner. Fräulein Hartmann, please step forward. Her legs moved without conscious thought. She stepped behind the canvas screen. The nurse was there. Evelyn Brennan, her name tag said. She smiled. It was a professional smile, but not unkind. We'll need you to remove your tunic for the examination, Nurse Brennan said in English, then repeated in simplified German. Jackie aussehen. Liesel's hands went to the buttons of her uniform tunic. They were shaking so badly she couldn't grip them properly. She looked around. The canvas screen was thin, barely a barrier. Light from outside created shadows. Anyone looking would see, and the tent flaps were wide open, and there were soldiers everywhere, standing, watching, waiting, not watching her specifically, just standing, just existing, just being there. But being there was enough. She could hear voices from outside, male voices, German prisoners talking quietly, American soldiers giving orders, the rustling of forms, the stamp of boots, life continuing normally while her world collapsed into this single moment of exposure. Her hands froze on the third button. She couldn't do this. She couldn't undress here, in this tent with these walls that weren't walls, with these men who weren't looking, but could look with this vulnerability that felt like death. Everything Frau Dietrich had said came flooding back. Every warning, every horror story, every reason to fear this exact moment. Dr. Thornton noticed her hesitation. He looked up from his clipboard. For the first time, he really looked at her. Not at a prisoner, not at a file number, at her, a 23-year-old woman who was shaking like a leaf in a storm. Fräulein Hartmann, his voice was gentler now. Are you all right? She wasn't all right. She was drowning. drowning in fear that had been planted in her mind 2 years ago and had grown roots so deep she couldn't breathe. The words came out barely above a whisper, in German first because English had abandoned her. Bitte, nicht vor allen. Then in broken English because she needed him to understand. Please, not in front of everyone. The tent went quiet. Dr. Thornton stood very still, the clipboard in his hands lowered slowly. He looked at her. Then he looked around the tent, at the translucent canvas walls, at the open flaps facing the processing yard, at the soldiers standing just outside, at the shadows playing across the fabric from the afternoon sun, at the hundreds of men in queues who weren't watching but were there present visible. His expression changed. Something shifted behind his eyes, understanding maybe, or recognition. Recognition that this wasn't about the medical procedure. This was about dignity, about being a human being who'd been taught to expect humiliation and was now facing it. 4 seconds passed. They felt infinite. Then Dr. Thornton straightened. He turned toward the tent entrance. His voice was calm but carried authority. Sergeant Whitmore. The sergeant appeared at the tent flap. Yes, sir. Clear the tent. Everyone out. Now. Whitmore blinked. Sir, protocol requires witnesses for examinations to ensure proper procedure and prevent accusations of impropriety. We need at least 2 personnel present plus medical staff. I set out, Sergeant. But sir, the processing schedule demands efficiency, and having to clear the tent for each prisoner will create significant delays, and Colonel Foster specifically requested expedited processing to handle the volume of POWs arriving daily, and maintaining proper protocol is essential for both our protection and theirs. And without witnesses present, we expose ourselves to potential accusations that could compromise the integrity of the entire operation. Dr. Thornton's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The steel underneath was enough. Sergeant Whitmore, every soldier except medical personnel will exit this tent immediately. You will close the tent flaps. You will post guards outside to ensure privacy. That is a direct order. Do you understand? Whitmore looked at Liesel, then at Dr. Thornton. Something passed between them. An understanding older than the war, older than a protocol. Yes, sir. He turned. All personnel exit the tent. Move to the perimeter. Close the flaps. Nobody enters without clearance. The soldiers filed out. 5 men. They looked confused but complied. The tent flaps were pulled closed. The canvas walls remained, but now there was a barrier. A real one. Not physical, but intentional. Someone had chosen to give her privacy. Someone had chosen to see her fear and respond with mercy instead of indifference. The tent dimmed as the flaps closed. The shadows disappeared. The feeling of exposure, of being watched, of being on display, it faded. Only Dr. Thornton and Nurse Brennan remained. He turned back to Liesel. His voice was quiet now, gentle in a way that made her throat ache. Take your time, Fräulein Hartmann. No one can see you. You're safe. Safe. That word again. It still didn't make sense. But for the first time since Hamburg, since the surrender, since the transport ship and the Atlantic crossing, and the arrival at this camp with its mountains and barbed wire, for the first time, something inside her unclenched. Just a little. Just enough to breathe. She started crying, silently, tears running down her face while her hands finally managed to unbutton her tunic. The examination took 4 minutes. Dr. Thornton was professional, efficient, respectful. He didn't comment on her tears, didn't ask questions, just did his job with the maximum possible dignity afforded to her. When it was done, when she was dressed again, when Nurse Brennan handed her a POW identification card with the number W17384 printed on it, Dr. Thornton made a note on his clipboard. You're healthy, he said in German. No medical concerns. You'll be assigned to the women's barracks, standard processing from here. He didn't say anything else, didn't make a speech, didn't ask for gratitude, just moved on to the next name on his list. Liesel exited the tent. The flaps had been opened again. The world continued. Nothing had changed, except everything had changed. She walked toward the barracks in a daze. The other women from her group were already there waiting. They looked at her with questions in their eyes. What happened? Greta whispered. Were you in there longer? Did they do something? Liesel couldn't answer. She sat on the edge of a wooden bunk and stared at her hands. They'd stopped shaking. That night, lying in the darkness of the barracks, listening to 43 women breathe in the silence of defeat, Liesel Hartmann had her first real thought since the surrender. Everything they told us was a lie. Not just small lies about battles or strategies. Not just propaganda about enemy strength or political ideology. Fundamental lies about what it meant to be human, about who the monsters were, about what happened when you fell into enemy hands. She'd been taught to fear humiliation. She'd been taught to expect cruelty. She'd been taught that the Americans were animals who would strip away her dignity as casually as they stripped away her uniform. Instead, a tired doctor in Colorado had ordered his soldiers out of a tent, had closed the flaps, had given her privacy when protocol didn't require it, when efficiency argued against it, when he had every reason to just follow procedure and move on to the next prisoner in an endless line of defeated Germans. He'd chosen mercy. That was the twist. The terrible, beautiful world, shattering twist. She'd been taught to fear the wrong thing. The real fear, the one she was only beginning to understand, wasn't what the Americans would do to her. It was what her own side had already done. The lies they'd planted, the hatred they'd cultivated, the fear they'd weaponized. Her own government had turned her into a person who couldn't undress for a medical examination without shaking, who expected violation, who'd been prepared to choose death over surrender. They'd made her into this. And an American doctor had shown her in 17 minutes on a May afternoon that she didn't have to stay this way. The war in her head, the real war, the one that mattered, it had started to crack. Not ended, not yet. That would take time, but cracked. Just enough to let in light. Outside, the Colorado night was cold and clear. The mountains stood dark against stars that didn't care about borders or uniforms or which side had won. Inside the barracks, Liesel closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like before the war, before the fear, before she learned to expect the worst from everyone. She couldn't remember. But maybe, just maybe, she could learn something new. Something Frau Dietrich hadn't taught her. Something the propaganda had never mentioned. That even enemies could choose to be human. That dignity could be freely given when it didn't have to be. That sometimes in the smallest moments, in a canvas tent with closed flaps and a doctor who saw a person instead of a prisoner, the entire architecture of hate could begin to crumble. She fell asleep thinking about those 17 minutes, about the choice Dr. Thornton had made, about what it meant that he'd made it. Tomorrow she would wake up still a prisoner. Still defeated, still German in an American camp, still 23 years old with no family, no home, no certainty about anything, except that the world she'd known was gone. But she would wake up with something new, something fragile but real. Hope. Not for victory, not for vindication. Just hope that humanity, real humanity, might still exist somewhere beneath the uniforms and flags and weapons. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The mountains didn't care. The war had ended. But for Liesel Hartmann, in the darkness of a POW barracks in Colorado, another war, quieter but more important, had just begun. The war to unlearn everything she'd been taught. The war to remember how to be human again. And on this night in this place, with the memory of closed tent flaps and a doctor's quiet mercy still fresh in her mind, she had her first small victory. She believed it might be possible. The days after May 7th passed in a strange fog of routine and revelation. Liesel woke each morning at 6 to the sound of bells. American bells, not German. The tone was different somehow. Less harsh. Or maybe that was just her mind playing tricks, trying to find meaning in metal striking metal. She dressed in the same Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, now cleaned and returned from the camp laundry. She stood for roll call with the other 43 women in her barracks. She ate breakfast in the mess hall. Oatmeal. Real oatmeal with brown sugar and milk. More food than she'd seen in months. And every morning she waited for the other shoe to drop. Because this couldn't be real. This treatment, this normalcy, this absence of cruelty, it had to be a trick, a psychological tactic. Soften them up before the real punishment began. That's what Frau Dietrich would have said. Trust nothing. Expect betrayal. But the betrayal never came. Instead, there was work. The women were assigned to camp labor. Nothing brutal, nothing designed to break them. Just work. Liesel was placed in the laundry detail, 8 hours a day washing uniform sheets, towels. The work was hard, physical, exhausting, but it was honest work, the kind her mother had done, the kind that left your hands raw but your conscience clear. The American soldiers who supervised were young. Most of them couldn't have been older than 25. They spoke limited German, relied on gestures and demonstration. They weren't cruel. They weren't particularly kind either. They were just men doing a job they hadn't asked for, counting down days until they could go home. Liesel watched them, studied them, tried to reconcile what she saw with what she'd been taught. These were supposed to be mongrels, animals, men without honor or discipline. That's what the propaganda had promised. But Private Miller from Kansas brought pictures of his baby daughter and showed them to anyone who'd look. Corporal Davidson from Tennessee hummed church hymns while sorting laundry. Sergeant Chen, wait. No, there was no Chen. Sergeant Whitmore checked on the women's section twice daily to ensure no one was bothering them. No one was crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. They were just men, tired, homesick, ready for the war to be over. That realization was almost harder than the fear had been. The second week, Germany officially surrendered. BE Day. Victory in Europe. The camp erupted in celebration. American soldiers cheered, drank, fired guns in the air. The German prisoners stood in silence, watching their conquerors celebrate their defeat. Liesel felt nothing. The surrender was just paperwork. The real defeat had happened months ago, in 1,000 small moments of realization that the war was lost. The cause was doomed. The future was uncertain. What she felt instead was a growing confusion, a cognitive dissonance that made her head ache. If the Americans were supposed to be barbaric, why was she being fed better than she'd eaten in 2 years? If they were supposed to be cruel, why had Dr. Thornton cleared that tent? If they were supposed to hate Germans with a passion that transcended reason, why did Private Miller show her pictures of his daughter and say in broken German, "You have family, sisters, brothers"? She'd nodded, had, past tense. Maybe. She didn't know. Dresden was ash. Her family's last letter had come in January, before the firebombing, before the world ended in phosphorus and flame. Miller had looked sad, actually sad, for her, for a German, for the enemy. "I'm sorry," he'd said, and he'd meant it. That was the thing that kept breaking her, the sincerity, the small mercies, the moments of unexpected humanity that didn't fit any narrative she'd been given. The third week brought medical follow-ups, standard procedure. Tuberculosis screening for all prisoners required regular monitoring. The women were called in groups of 6. Liesel's group was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. She hadn't seen Dr. Thornton since May 7th. Hadn't thought about him specifically, though she thought about what he'd done constantly. The memory of those closed tent flaps had become a kind of talisman, proof that not everything was as terrible as expected, proof that mercy existed. But seeing him again walking into the same medical tent where he'd made that choice, it brought everything back. The fear, the gratitude, the confusion. He looked even more tired than before. 3 weeks of processing thousands of prisoners would do that. He had shadows under his eyes. His white coat was stained with something, coffee maybe. His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he checked charts, recorded temperatures, listened to breathing. When it was Liesel's turn, he glanced at her file. His expression didn't change. Professional, neutral. If he remembered her, he didn't show it. "Fräulein Hartmann, how are you feeling? Any cough, fever, difficulty breathing?" His German was careful, correct. He asked the standard questions, performed the standard examination, took notes on his clipboard. The tent flaps were open today, no privacy screens. But it was just basic health screening, no undressing required. Just temperature, breathing check, visual assessment. 4 minutes. Then it was done. "You're healthy," he said. "Continue with your work assignment. Next screening in 2 weeks." That was all. No reference to May 7th, no acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a doctor doing his job. Liesel left the tent feeling oddly disappointed. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Gratitude seemed inappropriate. She was the prisoner. He was the captor. The power dynamic made any real conversation impossible, but she'd needed maybe some sign that that moment had mattered, that it hadn't just been protocol, That the choice to clear the tent, to close the flaps, to give her dignity when he didn't have to, that it had meant something. She walked back to the barracks in silence. That night, Greta asked her about the medical check. How was it, the American doctor? Was he decent? Liesel thought about how to answer. Decent seemed like such a small word for what Dr. Thornton had done, but it was also accurate. Yes, she said, he was decent. The weeks blurred together. May became June, became July. The routine was numbing in its predictability. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Letters were allowed now, though mail to and from Germany was chaos. The infrastructure was destroyed. Postal systems didn't exist. Finding anyone was nearly impossible. Liesel wrote to her mother anyway. Addressed it to their old street in Dresden. Described the camp, the mountains, the food. Said she was alive and safe. Didn't mention the fear or the confusion or the slow unraveling of everything she'd believed. She didn't expect a response. Dresden was rubble. Her family was probably dead. Writing the letter was an act of faith in a world where faith seemed ridiculous. But she wrote anyway. In late June, something changed in the camp. News filtered through. The American soldiers were talking about something they'd found. Camps, they said. Concentration camps. Places where Jews and political prisoners and anyone the Reich deemed undesirable had been sent. The rumors were horrific. Mass graves, gas chambers, thousands dead. Tens of thousands. More. Liesel heard the words and didn't believe them. Couldn't believe them. That was enemy propaganda. Atrocity stories designed to justify the war, to demonize Germany, to make the victors feel righteous. She said as much to Sophie one evening. Sophie, 19 years old, looked at her with hollow eyes. My aunt was Jewish, Sophie said quietly. She was sent to a camp in 1943. We never heard from her again. My mother said she'd been resettled, for labor, but we never heard anything. The silence that followed was heavy. Liesel wanted to argue, wanted to say that was different, that was just war necessity, that every nation did terrible things in wartime. But the words stuck in her throat, because if they'd lied about the Americans, about what capture would mean, about medical examinations and treatment in basic humanity, then what else had they lied about? The question was too big. The implications too vast. She pushed it away, but it kept coming back. July brought heat. Colorado summer was dry, brutal, the sun relentless. The laundry work became harder. The steam from the washing made the air thick, difficult to breathe. Liesel lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her hands developed permanent wrinkles from constant water exposure. But she was alive, fed, not tortured, not executed, just tired. The weekly medical checks continued. Every 2 weeks, Dr. Thornton examined the women prisoners. The routine never varied. Temperature, breathing, visual check, questions about symptoms, notes on clipboard, professional distance maintained. Liesel began to notice small things. The way he always positioned himself between the women and any soldiers who happened to be nearby. The way he spoke German, carefully making sure instructions were understood. The way he never rushed, never made anyone feel like they were an inconvenience. These weren't dramatic gestures. Nothing like clearing the tent. Just small courtesies. Basic respect. But they accumulated. They mattered. In early August, Japan surrendered. The war was truly over. Every war. All theaters. Done. The camp erupted again. Celebrations, drinking, chaos. The German prisoners watched from behind their fences, trying to process what this meant for them. Would they be sent home now, when to what Liesel stood in the barracks doorway and watched American soldiers dance in the compound, watched them embrace, watched them cry with relief that they'd survived, that it was finally over. She felt nothing. The war had ended for them. It hadn't ended for her. It wouldn't end for her for a long time. Maybe never. Because the real war, the one in her head, was just beginning. The war to reconcile what she'd been taught with what she'd experienced. The war to understand how she'd been so thoroughly deceived. The war to figure out who she was when everything she'd believed was a lie. That war had no armistice, no surrender. Just daily small battles with memory and doubt and crushing disillusionment. August brought news. Repatriation would begin soon. Not immediately. The logistics were complicated. Transportation destroyed. Germany divided into occupation zones. Millions of displaced persons trying to get home, but eventually they'd be sent back. Liesel tried to imagine returning to Dresden, tried to picture her mother's face, her sister, home. She couldn't. The images wouldn't form. Dresden was gone. The city she'd grown up in was ash. Even if the buildings were somehow rebuilt, the place itself was dead. You can't resurrect a ghost. September came with cooler air and changing leaves. The aspen trees on the mountainsides turned gold, a color so bright it hurt to look at. Beautiful and terrible at once. The medical checks continued. Liesel's appointment fell on a Thursday afternoon, same as always. She walked to the tent with 5 other women, waited her turn, stepped forward when her name was called. Dr. Thornton looked up from his clipboard. For the first time in 4 months, his professional mask slipped slightly. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed across his face. Recognition, maybe? Or concern. Fräulein Hartmann, you've lost weight. She nodded. Everyone had lost weight. Even with better food than the Wehrmacht provided, it wasn't enough to replace what years of deprivation had stolen. Are you eating? He asked. His German was better now. 4 months of daily practice had improved his accent. Yes, the food is good. But not enough. She didn't know how to answer yet. The food was adequate. More than adequate compared to what she'd had before. But her body was still catching up, still trying to recover from years of slow starvation. It's enough, she said. He made a note, didn't argue. Then he did something unexpected. He set down his clipboard and spoke quietly, switching from German to English and back, mixing languages when words failed. Miss Hartmann, I want you to know that your treatment here, all the prisoners' treatment, it's meant to be humane, not punitive. You understand? We're not here to punish. Just to process, to document, to eventually send you home. If you have concerns, medical or otherwise, you can speak to me or Nurse Brennan. We're not your enemy. The words landed strangely. We're not your enemy. But they were. That's what war meant. Enemy was the defining characteristic. German, American, enemy. Except it didn't feel that way anymore. Liesel looked at this man, this doctor, who'd cleared a tent for her, who checked on prisoners every week, who was telling her she could trust him when trust was the most dangerous thing she could offer. Why, she asked. In English, because German felt too vulnerable. Why did you do it in May? The tent. You could have followed protocol. Dr. Thornton was quiet for a long moment. The tent sounds continued around them. Other examinations. Nurses moving, equipment clinking, life proceeding normally while they stood in this bubble of conversation that shouldn't be happening. Because I saw a person, he said finally, not a prisoner, not an enemy, a young woman who was terrified. And I realized that whatever had happened in this war, whatever Germany did or we did, none of it justified adding to that fear. Dignity costs nothing. Mercy costs nothing. And sometimes those are the only things we can control. His words hung in the air between them. Liesel felt something crack inside her chest. Not break. Crack. Like ice on a river in early spring. Still solid, but starting to give way. Everything they told us about Americans, she said slowly, still in English, it was lies. All of it. Yes. They said you would hurt us, humiliate us. That capture was worse than death. I know what they told you. We found the propaganda materials in captured positions. The leaflets, the radio scripts. It was deliberate, designed to make you fight to the last, to prefer death over surrender. It worked. I was ready to do rather than come here. Dr. Thornton's expression was not pitying, just sad. I'm glad you didn't, he said. The examination resumed. Temperature normal, breathing clear, health status recorded. But something had shifted. Some barrier thin as canvas had been crossed. When Liesel left the tent that day, the world looked different. Not better, not worse, just different, more complicated, more human. That night in the barracks, she lay awake thinking about the conversation, about what Dr. Thornton had said. Dignity costs nothing, mercy costs nothing. If that was true, if those things were free, then why had they been so rare in her experience? Why had the Reich built an entire system on their absence? Why had dignity been the first casualty of ideology? The questions led to other questions, deeper ones, harder ones. If they'd lied about the Americans, what else was a lie? The cause, the war, the future they'd promised, everything. She'd been a good German, patriotic, dutiful. She'd volunteered for the Wehrmacht Auxiliary because it was right, because the fatherland needed her, because contributing was honor. But what if there was no honor in it? What if the entire structure was rotten from the beginning? What if she'd given years of her life to something fundamentally evil? The thought was unbearable. She pushed it away, focused on sleep, on not thinking, on the small mercy of unconsciousness. But the questions remained. October brought the first snow, light dustings that melted by afternoon previews of the winter to come. The camp routine continued unchanged. Work, food, sleep, medical checks, waiting. Always waiting. Rumors circulated about repatriation. Soon they said, maybe November, maybe December. The women would be sent back first, then the men. Priority for those with confirmed family in the Western zones. Everyone else would have to wait. Liesel had no confirmed family, no address that still existed. No one waiting for her that she knew of. She was low priority, dead last in a queue of millions. She didn't mind. Going back to Germany meant facing what remained, meant seeing Dresden reduced to rubble, meant learning which family members had died and how and whether their suffering had been quick or prolonged. Staying here meant delaying that knowledge, extending this strange limbo where anything was possible because nothing was certain. November arrived cold and gray. The mountains disappeared into low clouds. The camp became mud and slush and the constant drip of melting ice. Liesel's medical check that month was routine. Temperature, breathing questions, notes. Dr. Thornton looked tired. Everyone looked tired. The war was over, but its aftermath was exhausting in different ways. As she was leaving, he called her back. Fräulein Hartmann, a moment. She turned. He was holding an envelope, thin-stained, addressed in handwriting she recognized. Her mother's handwriting. The world stopped. The Red Cross located your family, Dr. Thornton said gently. Your mother and sister are alive. They're in Dresden in temporary housing. Your father died in the bombing. Your brother is listed as missing, presumed dead on the Eastern Front. I'm sorry, but your mother wrote, she wants you to know they're alive. They're waiting for you. Liesel took the envelope with shaking hands. Couldn't speak, couldn't process. Her mother was alive. Her sister was alive. Not everyone was dead. The grief came later. For her father, for her brother, for everyone who hadn't made it. But in that moment, standing in a medical tent in Colorado, holding a letter that had traveled thousands of miles through a destroyed continent to reach her, all she felt was overwhelming gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. Dr. Thornton nodded. You'll be eligible for repatriation soon. With confirmed family in the American zone, your priority. Probably late December or January. She nodded. Couldn't find words. Just stood there holding the envelope like it might disappear if she loosened her grip. Go, Dr. Thornton said. Read your letter. She went. In the barracks, she read her mother's words. Simple words. We're alive. We're together. Come home when you can. We love you. We're waiting. Liesel cried for the first time since the surrender. Not from fear or pain or trauma. From relief. From the sheer overwhelming fact that someone had survived. The next morning, she returned to the laundry. The work was the same, the routine unchanged, but the world had shifted on its axis. She had a reason to go home. People waiting for her. A future uncertain, but real. That made all the difference. December came with heavy snow. The camp was buried in white. Work continued, but everything was harder, colder, more exhausting. The women endured. What choice did they have? Liesel's name appeared on a repatriation list. Departure scheduled for early January. She had 6 weeks left in Colorado. 6 weeks before returning to a Germany she no longer recognized to rebuild a life from pieces she wasn't sure could fit together anymore. She felt no excitement, no dread either, just a kind of numb acceptance. This chapter was ending, another was beginning. That was all. Her final medical check was scheduled for late December. She walked to the tent through ankle-deep snow, her breath visible in the cold air. Inside the tent was warmer, heated by portable stoves that made the canvas glow. Dr. Thornton conducted the examination with the same professional efficiency as always. But at the end he paused. You're being repatriated in January. Yes. How do you feel about that? It was the first personal question he'd ever asked. Liesel considered her answer carefully. I don't know, she said honestly. Grateful to go home. Afraid of what home means now. He nodded, understanding without needing details. For what it's worth, he said, you've conducted yourself with dignity here. That matters. Whatever happens next, remember that you survived. That takes strength. She wanted to tell him that his small mercy in May had saved her. Not just physically, spiritually, that the choice to close those tent flaps had been the first crack in the edifice of lies she'd been fed. That his 17 minutes of kindness had started her on a path of unlearning, of questioning, of becoming someone new. But the words wouldn't come. The gratitude was too big for language. So she just said, thank you, Dr. Thornton, for everything. He extended his hand. She shook it. The gesture was formal, professional, appropriate, but it contained multitudes. She left the tent for the last time. January would bring the transport ship, the Atlantic crossing, the return to a continent still smoldering from 6 years of destruction. It would bring reunion with her mother, with her sister, with a city of ghosts. It would bring the hard work of rebuilding a life from ashes. But before all that, there was this moment, this recognition that even in the machinery of war, even in the dehumanizing process of captivity and defeat, individuals could still choose mercy, could still see each other as human. Dr. Thornton had chosen that, had chosen to clear a tent to respect fear, to offer dignity when nothing required it. And that choice, small and quiet and witnessed by no one who mattered, had changed everything. Not just for her, for how she understood the world, for what she believed about people, about enemies, about the possibility of grace in ungraceful times. The war had taught her to fear. Dr. Thornton had taught her that fear could be unlearned, that humanity, real, messy, complicated humanity, was more powerful than propaganda, that 17 minutes could matter more than 17 years of indoctrination. She walked back to the barracks through the snow. Above, the stars were impossibly bright in the thin mountain air, the same stars that shone over Dresden, over the Atlantic, over everywhere war had been and would be again. But tonight they just looked like stars, not omens or symbols or signs of divine favor for one side or another, just light from distant places, indifferent to human suffering, beautiful because of that indifference. Liesel Hartmann went to sleep that night with one certainty. Whatever came next, whoever she became in the aftermath, she would remember this. The tent, the closed flaps, the choice one tired doctor made to see a person instead of a prisoner. Memory, she was learning, was survival, and some memories were worth protecting, worth carrying forward into whatever future waited beyond the wire, beyond the ocean, beyond the war that had ended everywhere, except in the hearts of those who'd lived through it. January 17th, 1946, Camp Carson, Colorado. The transport trucks arrived before dawn. Liesel stood in the processing yard with 237 other German prisoners, all women, all scheduled for repatriation. They wore the same Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms they'd arrived in, now clean and patched where possible. Each carried a small canvas bag with personal items, letters from home, a few photographs, nothing else. There was nothing else. The mountains were invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, just black shapes against a slightly less black sky. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Liesel's breath came out in clouds that dissipated instantly like ghosts of ghosts. She thought about the irony. 8 months ago, she'd arrived at this camp expecting torture, humiliation, death. Now she was leaving well-fed, healthy, alive. More alive than when she'd arrived in ways that had nothing to do with physical survival. The repatriation processing took hours. Names checked against lists. Documentation verified. Medical clearances confirmed. POW cards collected. Each woman received a folder with papers, proof of their time in American custody, proof they'd been processed correctly, proof that whatever happened next wasn't on American hands. When it was Liesel's turn, the clerk looked at her file and nodded. Hartmann, Liesel, destination Dresden, American sector. Your family has been notified of your expected arrival approximately 6 to 8 weeks, depending on transport schedules and conditions in Europe. Any questions? She had 1,000 questions, but none this clerk could answer. No questions. Good luck, Miss Hartmann. The words surprised her. Good luck. From an American soldier to a German prisoner. as if they were just people now, the war over, moving forward into whatever came next. Thank you. The trucks took them to Denver. From Denver, trains east to New York. The journey took 4 days. America passed outside the windows. Flat plains, small towns. Cities still celebrating victory with banners and flags. The prisoners watched in silence, trying to comprehend this vast country that had absorbed them for 8 months. This place that had treated them better than their own side had in the war's final years. New York Harbor was chaos. Thousands of people, military and civilian, moving in every direction. The women were kept separate, processed through a military terminal, loaded onto a transport ship bound for Bremerhaven. The ship was a Liberty ship converted for passenger transport. Cramped but functional. The voyage would take 2 weeks, maybe 3, if weather was bad. Liesel stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the dock. The Statue of Liberty passed on the port side, green and massive and surreal. Liberty. What did that even mean anymore? She'd left Germany a prisoner of ideology. She was returning a prisoner of disillusionment. Was that freedom, or just a different kind of cage? The Atlantic in January was brutal. Waves 40 feet high. The ship pitched and rolled. Most of the women were seasick. Liesel spent days in her bunk, too nauseous to eat, trying not to think about the return journey ahead. Trying not to imagine what Dresden looked like now, what her mother looked like, her sister, whether home was even a real place anymore or just a word that had lost its meaning. 2 weeks became 3. The ship encountered storms, engine trouble, delays. By the time they finally approached the European coast, it was mid-February. Cold gray, the sky and sea merging into one endless field of nothing. Bremerhaven Harbor was destroyed. The port facilities were rubble, temporary docks, jury-rigged from salvaged materials. The city beyond was a wasteland. Buildings collapsed, streets cratered, people moving through the ruins like survivors of an apocalypse, which Liesel supposed they were. Processing took another week. The British controlled this zone. They were efficient but overwhelmed. Millions of displaced persons trying to get somewhere, anywhere. The infrastructure didn't exist. The trains barely ran. Roads were destroyed. Communication was chaos. Liesel waited with thousands of others in a transit camp, tents on frozen ground, minimal food, no heat. After 8 months in Colorado with regular meals and warm barracks, the deprivation was shocking. This was Europe now. This was victory. For everyone. She finally got transport on February 28th, a military truck convoy heading south and east. They traveled through the British zone into the American sector, through what used to be German cities. Hanover was rubble. Magdeburg was rubble. Every place was rubble. The truck dropped her outside Dresden on March 3, 1946, late afternoon. Cold. The driver gave directions to the refugee housing district where her family was registered. Then he drove away, leaving her standing on a road she didn't recognize, leading to a city that no longer existed. Dresden had been beautiful once. Baroque architecture, art galleries, churches with spires that touched clouds. The Florence of the North, they'd called it. Now it was a cemetery of stone. The firebombing in February 1945 had been absolute. Entire districts erased. The old city center was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Foundations remained. Outlines of buildings. But the structures themselves had burned, collapsed, been cleared away by work crews who couldn't keep up with the scale of destruction. Liesel walked through streets she'd known her entire life and recognized nothing. Every landmark gone. Every familiar corner disappeared. Navigation was impossible. She had to ask for directions 3 times before finding the refugee housing district. It was a collection of damaged apartment buildings on the city's outskirts. Structures that had survived the bombing now housed families who'd lost everything. 8 to 10 people per room. Minimal electricity, no running water. Survival, not living. She found her mother in a 3rd-floor apartment, sharing a single room with 14 other people. Her sister was at a work detail clearing rubble for food rations. The reunion was quiet. No dramatic embraces, no tears. Just 2 women who'd both survived looking at each other, trying to recognize who they'd become. Her mother was 51, but looked 70. Gray hair, hollowed cheeks, hands that shook with malnutrition. But alive, still herself underneath the damage. Liesel, Mama, They held each other, not long. Public emotion was a luxury. There were other families in the room. Privacy didn't exist. Grief was communal. Her mother told her about her father's death. Quick, she said. The firebombing came fast. He'd gone to help neighbors and never returned. They'd found remains weeks later, identified him by his wedding ring. Her brother was missing. Last seen on the Eastern Front in December 1944. No word since. Missing meant dead. Everyone knew that, but officially missing so hope remained even when hope was cruelty. That night, Liesel slept on the floor with 11 other people in a room that smelled of unwashed bodies and despair. Outside, Dresden was silent. No traffic, no industry, just the wind moving through ruins. She lay awake thinking about Colorado, about mountains and cold, clean air, about food that came regularly, about medical tents and doctors who chose mercy, about how strange it was that the enemy camp had felt safer than home. The months that followed were about survival. Liesel found work clearing rubble. Everyone worked clearing rubble. The city had to be rebuilt literally from the ground up. The pay was minimal. Food rations. Occasionally occupation currency that bought almost nothing. She saw her sister Anna 3 times a week. Anna was 17 now, thin as wire, serious in a way teenagers shouldn't be. They didn't talk about the war. What was there to say? They'd all lost. They were all trying to figure out what came next. By summer 1946, a rhythm had established. Work, food, sleep, repeat. Dresden slowly, painfully slowly began to rebuild. Not to what it was. That was impossible. But to something functional, something livable. Liesel met Friedrich in September 1946. He was 28, a former Wehrmacht soldier who'd lost his left arm at Stalingrad. He worked as a clerk in the ration distribution office. They spoke 3 times before he asked if she'd walk with him after work. They married in April 1948. No ceremony, no celebration, just papers signed at a government office. Marriage was practical, not romantic. 2 people surviving together is easier than surviving alone. Their first child came in 1949. A daughter, they named her Margaret after Friedrich's mother who'd died in the war. Their second came in 1951. Another daughter, Anna, after Liesel's sister. Their third in 1954. A son named Klaus, after no one. Just a name that meant hope for the future. Life continued. The 1950s brought rebuilding. Marshall Plan money. Jobs returning. Dresden would never be what it was, but it became something. A city. A place where people lived and worked and raised children who didn't remember the war. Liesel worked as a secretary. Her English from the POW camp proved useful. She translated documents for companies doing business with British and American occupation forces. The work was steady, the pay adequate. They moved from refugee housing to a small apartment to eventually in 1962, a house on the city's outskirts. Normal life, or what passed for it. But here's what Liesel Hartmann never did. She never talked about the war. Not to Friedrich, who had his own silences. Not to her children, who asked occasionally when young and then learned not to ask. Not to friends or neighbors or anyone. The war was a black box, sealed, buried. Too painful, too complicated, too entangled with shame and guilt, and questions that had no good answers. Her children knew only the basics. Mama worked as a telephone operator during the war. She was captured. She spent time in an American prisoners camp. She came home. That's all. End of story. They didn't know about the propaganda, the fear, the lust, the tent, the 17 minutes that had changed everything. They didn't know about Dr. Thornton or Nurse Brennan or Sergeant Whitmore. They didn't know their mother had once believed Americans were monsters and then learned slowly and painfully that the real monsters had been wearing different uniforms. She couldn't tell them. How do you explain to your children that you'd believe terrible things, supported terrible things, even if only through silence and compliance? How do you reconcile being a good mother with having been part of something evil? Even tangentially, I don't. Even unknowingly, you don't. You stay silent. You let the past stay buried. You focus on giving them a better future and hope that's enough to atone for a past you can't change. The decades passed. The 1960s became the 1970s. Liesel's children grew up, went to university, got jobs, married. Margareta became a teacher. Anna became a nurse. Klaus became an engineer. They were good people, thoughtful, kind. They didn't carry their parents' trauma, at least not obviously. Liesl turned 55 in 1977. Her first grandchild, Anneliese Margaretta's daughter, was 8 years old. Precocious, curious, always asking questions. One evening in October 1977, Anneliese stayed overnight at Liesl's house. Friedrich was working late. They were alone. Anneliese was doing homework, a school project about family history. She looked up from her notebook. Oma, what was the war like? Liesl had deflected this question from her children dozens of times. But something about Annaliese's face, her genuine curiosity uncomplicated by judgment, something made Liesl pause. She was quiet for a long moment. Anneliese waited, 8 years old but patient. Finally, Liesl spoke. The war was terrible. Many people died. We lost everything. But I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else. Not your mother, not your grandfather. No one. Anneliese put down her pencil, gave her grandmother full attention. Liesl told her about May 7, 1945, about the camp in Colorado, about being 23 years old and more afraid than she'd ever been, about the propaganda that had taught her to fear surrender worse than death, about the medical tent with its thin canvas walls and open flaps facing hundreds of eyes. She told her about standing there, shaking, about whispering, please, not in front of everyone, about expecting humiliation and cruelty, because that's what she'd been taught to expect. And then she told her about Dr. Thornton, about how he'd paused, how he'd looked around, how he'd made a choice. He ordered everyone out, Liesl said quietly. Every soldier. He closed the tent flaps. He gave me privacy when he absolutely didn't have to. When protocol said to just continue. When efficiency demanded speed. He chose to see me as a person instead of a prisoner. And that choice changed everything. Anneliese was staring at her grandmother with wide eyes on, what did it change, Oma? Liesl thought about how to explain something she'd spent 32 years trying to understand herself. I'd been taught that Americans were monsters, that surrender meant torture and death, that they were less than human. And in 17 minutes, a tired doctor in Colorado showed me that everything I'd been taught was a lie. Not just wrong, a deliberate lie designed to keep us fighting, keep us afraid, keep us serving a cause that was already lost. She paused. The memories were still sharp after 3 decades. That's when I learned Liebchen, that the war in your head can end before the war in the world ends. That one person choosing kindness, it can break through years of propaganda. That dignity and mercy, those cost nothing but mean everything. And that sometimes the people you're taught to fear are the ones who save you. Anneliese absorbed this in silence, then asked the question that mattered. Why didn't you tell Mama or Uncle Klaus or anyone? Liesl's throat tightened. This was the hard part. Because I was ashamed, not of what happened in that tent, of what I'd believed before it, of how thoroughly I'd been deceived, of being part of something so evil, even if I was just a small part, even if I didn't fully understand. The shame was too heavy, easier to stay silent than to explain. She looked at her granddaughter directly. But I'm telling you because you should know. You should know that humans are capable of terrible things when they believe lies, but also capable of beautiful things when they choose mercy. Both are true, both matter, and remembering both is how we prevent it from happening again. Anneliese nodded slowly, 8 years old, trying to process concepts most adults struggled with. Do you ever think about him, the doctor? Every day, for 32 years, every single day. That was the truth. Every day since May 7, 1945, Liesl had thought about Dr. Thornton's choice, about those 17 minutes, about how differently her life might have gone if he'd followed protocol, if he'd been less compassionate, if he'd seen a prisoner instead of a person. That one small mercy had echoed through decades, had changed not just that moment, but every moment after, had given her permission to unlearn hate, to question what she'd been taught, to become someone different than who she was raised to be. Small mercies echo forever. That was the final realization, the one she'd been circling for 32 years. The kindness you show someone in their darkest moment doesn't just help them survive that moment. It gives them a foundation to build a life on, a proof that humanity exists even in inhumane times. Dr. Thornton probably didn't remember her. Why would he? She was one prisoner among thousands, one examination among countless others, 17 minutes in a career of decades. But for her, those 17 minutes were everything. Annalise finished her homework. They had tea. They talked about other things, school, friends, normal life. But something had shifted. A story had been passed down, a memory preserved. The years continued. The 1980s came. Germany reunified in 1990. The Cold War ended. History moved forward, always forward, never learning quite enough from the past, but stumbling towards something hopefully better. Liesel retired in 1988. She and Friedrich lived quietly. They traveled occasionally, visited their children, watched their grandchildren grow. Life was good. Not perfect, still shadowed by memories that never quite faded, but good enough. October 1993. Liesel woke one morning feeling strange. A tightness in her chest, difficulty breathing. Friedrich called an ambulance. Heart attack. Massive. The doctors did what they could. She died on October 14th, 1993. 71 years old, surrounded by family. Peaceful as these things go. The funeral was small, family only. She'd requested no ceremony, no speeches, just burial in Dresden's new cemetery. A simple stone with her name and dates. Nothing about the war, nothing about survival, just a name and numbers marking time past. Her children cleaned out the house in November, found her papers, letters from the war, the letter from her mother that had reached her in Colorado, her POW identification card number, W17384, carefully preserved in a folder. Margaret looked at it, this relic from a time her mother never discussed. We should preserve this. For history. They contacted the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The museum had been collecting documents about the war, about prisoners, about all aspects of that period. They welcomed the donation. In March 1994, a researcher named David Hoffman was cataloging new acquisitions. He came across Liesel Hartmann's POW documents, standard material, identification card, repatriation papers, a letter from her mother. But something made him curious. The camp she'd been held at, Camp Carson, Colorado. He had access to military archives. He decided to cross-reference. He found the medical logs, boxes of them, thousands of examinations documented. Dr. M. Thornton had kept meticulous records as military protocol required. Hoffman searched for prisoner W17384, found the entry dated May 7, 1945. It was one line. Nothing special, just a standard medical notation in a ledger full of standard medical notations. Patient W17384, routine examination completed, privacy protocols observed per basic human dignity. Released to barracks, no medical concerns, MT, that was all. No elaboration, no explanation, no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Just privacy protocols observed per basic human dignity. Hoffman stared at those words for a long time. Basic human dignity, not extraordinary mercy, not heroic compassion, just basic, basic, as if it was the simplest, most obvious thing in the world, as if treating prisoners with dignity was just what you did, protocol or not. He thought about all the documents he'd cataloged, all the horror stories, all the evidence of what humans could do to each other when they stopped seeing each other as human. And here was a counter story, not dramatic, not cinematic, just a doctor in Colorado making a choice that seemed so ordinary he barely noted it in his records. Privacy protocols observed per basic human dignity. That phrase would haunt Hoffman for the rest of his career because it contained multitudes. It contained the entire question of what war does to people and what people can choose to do despite war. Dr. Thornton didn't see his actions as heroic. They were basic, basic humanity, the minimum required to see another person as a person. And that basicness, that ordinariness, that simple choice to maintain dignity when nothing required it, that had saved Liesel Hartmann. Not just her body, her soul, her capacity to believe humans could be decent, her foundation for rebuilding a life. The story doesn't end with revelation or resolution. It ends with a notation in a medical log. One line, 17 words, basic human dignity. That's the paradox. The greatest acts of mercy aren't always grand gestures. Sometimes they're just someone choosing to be decent when decency isn't required. Someone seeing a person when it would be easier to see a category. Someone taking 17 minutes to close tent flaps because a young woman was afraid. Doctor. Marcus Thornton died in 1982 in San Francisco. He'd returned to civilian medicine after the war, became a general practitioner, treated patients for 40 years, never spoke publicly about his service, never sought recognition, just lived his life, made his choices, tried to be decent. He never knew what those 17 minutes meant to Liesl Hartman. Never knew she thought about him every day for 32 years. Never knew his small mercy had echoed through decades, through a life rebuilt, through a story told to a granddaughter on an October evening in 1977. He just did his job, saw a person, made a choice, moved on. And that finally is what makes it matter. Not the drama, not the heroics, the ordinariness. The proof that even in the machinery of war, even in systems designed to dehumanize individuals, can still choose humanity, not as exception, as basic behavior. Privacy protocols observed per basic human dignity. 17 words that meant everything. That broke propaganda. That changed a life. That echoed through decades until becoming a story worth preserving, worth telling, worth remembering. Because sometimes history isn't made in grand gestures. Sometimes it's made in a canvas tent in Colorado. By a tired doctor, making a basic choice to see a person, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. Liesl Hartman learned that on May 7, 1945, carried it through 48 more years, told one person her granddaughter when the time was right, then died knowing the story would continue. That's how mercy works. It echoes, generation to generation, story to story, small act to small act, until maybe eventually basic human dignity becomes actually basic, actually human, actually the minimum we expect from each other. The war ended in 1945. For Liesl, it ended that day in May when Dr. Thornton chose to close the tent flaps. For the rest of us, for everyone, trying to navigate a world still full of propaganda and fear, and reasons to see each other as enemies, the war continues. Until we remember that dignity costs nothing. Mercy costs nothing. Seeing a person instead of a category costs nothing. And sometimes in the smallest moments, those nothings become everything.